I also think that this day is also a way to reflect upon how what we do in our lives is so much shaped by our personal experiences, our family upbringing, our socialization, and those tipping point experiences, to draw from Malcolm Gladwell's work, that can pop up unexpectedly in our lives at any point. And taking advantage of them and responding to them is really, I think, one of our challenges. So I thought it would be really appropriate to say a little bit about my background, because I think it is no accident I ended up with this wonderful group of women, originally called the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, and we now go by the name Our Bodies Ourselves, since that's what everyone called us anyway. And I grew up around here. I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts, and I had a father who had survived the Armenian genocide. He was actually 5 years old when his mother and his younger sister were whisked through the woods. He came to this country after living in Marseille at the age of about 16, 17, with no English. He knew French and Armenian. And he was very good at math and was headed to MIT when his father died, and he had to work during the day and support the family. So his dream of going to MIT never happened, but it's because of him that I developed a love of math and focused on that actually even into college. But he did several things when I was young that were really then extraordinary, although I didn't realize it. One is that he gave me a copy of Bertrand Russell's Marriage and Morals. How many of you have ever seen that book? Marriage and Morals. Well, you know Bertrand Russell is the great British philosopher, and he also was reading George Santayana, John Dewey, people like that, who were very forward thinkers for their time. But in this book, Bertrand Russell tells young people not to get married till they live together, so they know what they're getting in for. And of course, I'm in a world where you always get married. You're not even supposed to have sex till you get married. And then I'm thinking, why is my father giving me this book? And turns out he was a very liberal thinker in lots of ways. But his impact on me is unmistakably profound. And then there was my mother, who was a member of the League of Women Voters. She worked for Adlai Stevenson. I was just a little kid. I didn't know what that meant. I knew she was a Democrat, and I had a sense of what Republicans and Democrats were because my father used to debate a good friend of his who was head of the Romance Language Department at Wellesley College, and he would come over on Saturday. They were both Armenian, and they would have these raging fights about this man named Richard Nixon. Now, mind you, this is 1956, 7. And my father said to this man, mark my word, that man is going to do this country great damage. It's very interesting. You look back and remember these things, but when they're happening, you don't know. But my mother then went on to become a yoga teacher. She was one of these women, didn't know the word feminism, didn't know about the women's movement, but she did want to go to medical school as a high school student. She was valedictorian of her class. There's no way that could happen. She went on to become a lab technician, but she always resented that somehow the education was not there for her, but it was there for other people, mostly men in medicine at that point. And I could see her resentment even as a young girl, that somehow being a mother of 5 children and even doing the lab technician stuff isn't really what her dream was about. So that was a beginning of getting a sense of how women had different opportunities than those men had. I did well in school. You know, I was a valedictorian too, but I had the experience of winning a math and science award and being told it was too bad I won it because a young man might not get into MIT because he didn't get it. And I went home and told my father, and he said, don't pay any attention. But I thought that was odd. I didn't understand that it came from a pervasive sexism in our society. I didn't know that word. I mean, I grew up in a very sheltered way. So I went off to college, not far away, and I kind of got very interested in lots of different issues. You know, student-directed learning. John Holt was one of my mentors, even as an undergraduate. And I had no idea the women's movement was burgeoning around me. Actually graduated and went to live in upstate New York in June or July of 1970. With no awareness of the women's movement in this city. So it tells you something about how it can go on right before you and you just don't know about it. if you're not reading or seeing the right things. And by the way, for those of you interested in that period of time here, there's a marvelous documentary, probably one of the best, that tells the story of the women's liberation movement here in Massachusetts, and it's called Left on Pearl. Any of you have seen it? It is marvelous, and it was shown at the Brattle Theater not long ago, and it's the story of how women on one of the women's liberation marches made a left turn on Pearl Street, coming down Mass Ave, went all the way to Mem Drive, and took over the 889 Mem Drive building, which was owned by Harvard University. It's a wonderful story, and it led to the creation of the Women's Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, probably the longest standing women's center in the country. Actually, in 1969, I was an undergraduate. There was a very important women's liberation conference held at Emmanuel College. How many of you knew that or went to it? A few know it. Emmanuel College is a Catholic women's school. I look back and wonder, how did they let a women's liberation conference where they were talking about sexuality and abortion and everything under the sun? Now, how did it happen at a place like that? To this day, we don't know. But I'll tell you, those nuns are amazing. And, you know, Simone Campbell and the nuns on the bus, and you all remember what just happened in the last few years, and their continuing role in healthcare reform. It's remarkable. And I myself, after I got involved with Our Bodies, Our Cells, saw that at the Cardinal Cushing Central High School in South Boston. It doesn't exist anymore. But I was asked to come in to speak to 9th graders. I was part of Our Bodies, Our Cells. And they said, you can talk about anything you want. I said, really? And I did. I talked about lots of things. One of the nuns said, this kind of sex education is so important. We had 7 girls aged 13 and 14 get pregnant last year. So this was in the mid-70s. And she said, this is a crisis here, and the girls know nothing. They mostly get pregnant because they have no idea what's going on. So I did, you know, the usual thing, did an Our Bodies, Our Cells talk, and afterwards, one of the nuns, the nurse, took me into her office, and she showed me a stash of contraceptives that she showed to 11th and 12th grade girls, sometimes younger, because she wanted them to be prepared, wanted them to be educated. And she knew she shouldn't be doing this. And I looked at her and I said, how can you get away with this? She said, well, I think the students know if they tell people and the word gets out, I'll lose my job. And I said, this is against your teaching. She said, no, it really isn't. She said, I look and see what's going on with these girls and how they're mostly older men who are having sex with them, and they end up with these pregnancies. Their lives are sometimes really damaged in a very long-term fashion. And she looked up and she said, I know he wants me to do this. I thought, my goodness, a nun with a direct connection to God telling her to do something other than what the Pope does. So it says something about radical behavior in all settings around us. I mean, you can identify people who do things like that in your world as well. So out of that conference, 1969, spring, a group of women continued to meet. They had gotten together in one of these bodies workshops, and it was co-led by Miriam Hawley, one of the co-founders of Our Bodies, Our Cells. She still lives around here. And women were so excited about talking openly about sexuality, about some of the health issues, their pregnancy and birth experiences, things that they didn't know very much about, but they knew they were troubled. One of the defining features of getting medical care at that point in time, late 60s, early 70s, was that in medicine, and at that point 98% of OBGYNs were male, they were trained in a rather horrific fashion. If you read their textbooks, you would not believe it. You know, the core of the female personality consists of masochism, passivity, and female narcissism. That's a quote. And it took 20 years to get it out of that particular textbook. So the training was problematic. And these women all experienced serious sexism, paternalism, and condescension with almost all of their exchanges. Now, a few had discovered really terrific physicians who were responsive, receptive, and there were nurses around who, of course, were largely female, of course, and were quite willing to answer questions and guide women to materials. This group of women decided to do their own research. They went to Countway Library at Harvard Medical School, which the public was allowed access to. They spoke with the physicians and others who were friendly and open. And they continued to meet, and to make a long story short, they could pull together these little courses for the community. They mimeographed pieces of that reflected their research, plus their own personal experiences. And what was the hallmark of all editions of Our Bodies, Ourselves was the combination of fact, research, what we saw in the medical literature, and our own lived experiences. Then over the years, we realized that actually there was very little good research about many women's health issues. That what was done, particularly in obstetrics and gynecology, was done because of tradition, was done because we always did it that way, but not because we had a good evidence basis for it. So we were among those calling for the Office of Research on Women's Health at NIH, and of course you've seen in the last 20, 30 years a lot more research that's focused on the particular and unique needs of women. And I think that though we began with demystifying healthcare and asking to be treated as adults and not having to feel like we were out of line by asking a question. I mean, back in those days, if you had a sexually transmissible infection, usually it was VD or gonorrhea, your husband was told by the physician that you had a problem, you were getting a drug, but the physicians often knew that the source of infection was the husband. So the husband would get told, be careful now. The woman was often not told what was even wrong. So that's the kind of paternalism that women faced in those days. So we gradually moved away from just demystifying, understanding what our bodies were about, what was menstruation really about, what's involved with pregnancy, birth, and contraception was, of course, not even generally available when we first got going. A lot has changed over the years. Then we moved into this other arena of, well, is it safe or is it effective? The drug we're given, the surgical procedure that's being recommended. And we quickly learned from the research that was beginning to be done that we did many too many hysterectomies. It was considered out of one big study out of New York that 1/3 of all hysterectomies were totally unnecessary. This was a health insurance plan study, and of course the insurers cared about this kind of thing because they didn't want to pay for unnecessary surgery. So we also looked at what was then a high rate of cesarean section. Now it's of course gone through the roof, but there were concerns about that, and increasingly concerns about the use of psychotropic drugs like Valium and Librium, which have been supplanted by newer generations of drugs, but given out very freely and liberally and often inappropriately. Those kinds of issues really, raised our consciousness, got us going. And we were very much, from the start, concerned about the health and well-being of all women. We learned early on that the most important determinant of good health and well-being is what? It's poverty. We've got, well, of course, income. Poverty, if you live in poverty, that is going to be the most important defining factor in terms of whether you can be healthy or not. So when we talk about having adequate income, when you listen to what Enid said earlier, you get the picture. That if you don't have reasonable access to resources and you have to live in poverty, you have so many strikes against you, obtaining good health and well-being is really very difficult. So we were concerned about racism, about classism, about sexism, all the sort of things that were around us. Many of us had been active in the civil rights movement or the peace movement, but the women in Our Bodies, Ourselves who are older than I am. I was the youngest woman when we incorporated in early '72. We actually were meeting in '71 with commercial publishers. Simon & Schuster was the publisher that won in the end. When we incorporated, and I was the youngest, I was acutely aware of how even in the short span of time, and some of these women were 5, 10 years older than I was, things had changed radically. That I was in a cohort where women weren't as easily silenced. We were active in these movements, but in groups like Students for a Democratic Society or in some of the civil rights organizations, women often had the experience of being sidelined. Go make the coffee, you go do something else, but we'll make the big decisions. And it was some of the braver and more articulate women that wrote about this and actually said, we need something besides this. We need a women's movement too. We need a women's movement within these other social justice movements. And that was really one of the reasons Our Bodies, Ourselves got going. There was a level of anger and frustration around that level of treatment, in addition to the frustration with getting good medical care and realizing that we were all so painfully ignorant. And as we learned over the years, sometimes physicians were painfully ignorant. And it's not because they were stupid or they didn't care. It's because nobody had done the research that we needed to be well informed about so many of these issues. So I want to digress here just for a second and say, you know, we did have a big impact. The Library of Congress named Our Bodies, Ourselves one of 88 books that shaped America in a big exhibition. It was named by Time magazine a couple of years back as one of the 100 most influential and important books of the last century, well, since 1923, since Time began. That's when Time magazine began, so that's when Time began. But nonfiction books in English, I want to say that. It's not all books in the world. They were not so presumptuous to think that that's all that mattered. But as we look now back at all of this, we realize that there's a lot left to do. There's a lot that we started out trying to take on, made a little progress, but not as much as we would have liked. And that we are really, at this point in our lives, passing the torch, passing the mantle to generations behind us to lead the way. And they are. They're using social media. They're doing amazing things, which I'll talk about in a minute. Along this trajectory, one of our members, and mind you, most of us are not in the health field. We're actually the example of how lay individuals can learn about health issues and put in lay language material that is accurate, in lay language, understandable, and is effective at communicating necessary facts. One of our members, Pamela Berger, who was an art historian, a professor at Boston College, even back then, and she worked on the early abortion chapters, she decided that she wanted to make a film. And mind you, all she was an academic at a school nearby, but she had learned this parable. It's, you know, a medieval woman healer in France, and it has to do with a greyhound dog that became a saint. I won't tell you the whole story, but she wanted to do a film based upon this amazing story and this medieval woman healer who had a run-in with the Catholic Church. So she found Suzanne Schiffman, who was the right-hand person to Francois Truffaut, whose film some of you had seen. And she's also fluent in French and goes to France. And she said, I want you to help me make a film. And this is why I want you all to be brave in whatever dream you have.